In order to ensure that we can have more time for discussion in this week's Blackboard Collaborate session, I thought I'd record a quick little video here to go over some of this background theory or information, just to, again, set the stage for our discussion. So this week's topic, we're actually going to be dealing with two separate topics, but I think that they're related. And the first one is looking at kind of two major pieces. First, as it states here, the evolutionary origins for the sex differences. So why do we see the differences that we do in the biological sexes of our species? And then the second part is looking at how we've used some of these evolutionary models and also primate models to then explain or attempt to explain what first early life looked like for our earliest ancestors, for the hominins, but then also to explain potentially the origins of the rise of gender roles. Now, I can't go into the origin of our species at length. We simply don't have time for it in this course, but acknowledging that some of you do not have a background in biological anthropology and have potentially not been exposed to some of these ideas before, I thought I would just kind of summarize them here. So we know that at least 6 million years ago, there was a divergence between us, the human primates, and the non-human primates. And that this divergence, this kind of split, occurred somewhere in Africa. And our primary source of evidence for this split between non-human and human primates comes not just from the fossil record, but also from genetic analyses as well. And DNA analyses of our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, so the great apes, has suggested that this division probably occurred somewhere between 7 and 9 million years ago. So basically, all of the other non-human primates go off on their own evolutionary pathways, leading to the non-human primates we see living today, which is why I refer to them as our relatives and not our ancestors, right? We share a last common ancestor with them, but they are not our ancestors directly. And then down another pathway went the primates, the non-human primates, but really human-like primates that are our direct ancestors. And we refer to these as the hominins. And then, so from about 6 million years ago on, we start to see some key developments that we see as the hallmarks of our species and, again, of our ancestors. Of course, the expansion or the enlargement or the encephalization, so of the brain, is a key thing, but also bipedal locomotion is seen as one of the anatomical landmarks that is key for understanding, again, the origin of our species. But we can't just look at anatomy in order to explain humans, right? We also have to look at the big C, culture. And the most recent evidence suggests that we see the earliest stone tools, which is the earliest material culture that we've been able to find, the earliest evidence of culture that we have preserved and recorded in the archaeological record is stone tools, and those date to about 3.4 million years ago. So this is kind of the basis of it, right? And then basically what we see is changes in our anatomy and in our culture over time. We see at some points what seems to be almost like an explosion of different hominins. So there's a whole bunch of different human-like ancestors running around. And then over time, we see a reduction leading eventually to us, right? And it's interesting that we're kind of the last of the hominins that are left running around. And we can find traces, though, of our ancestors, again, not just in terms of the culture we have today, of course, which has changed over time, our anatomy, which has also changed over time, but also in our DNA as well. So we have a fossil record, so we can look at the anatomical characteristics of these hominins. We have the archaeological records that can tell us something about the culture of these hominins, but the behavioral piece, their ways of thinking, their feeling, what their lived experience was like, gets a little bit more complicated. And of course, we also have like the environmental paleontological record as well that tells us something about the environment in which they were living, the plants and animal resources they had access to, and also then climate changes that they experienced experience that also would have driven selection for the attributes we then find in the fossil record. But again, the lived experience is harder to get at. So what these hominins would have behaved like, for that, this is when we then turn to our non-human primates, to the living ones, and we use them as analogs for our human ancestors, right? So what do we know about primates, and primates particularly as a group of mammals? Well, variation and plasticity are the key. That what makes primates so successful is that primates have been able to adapt to a wide range of environments. We have a whole bunch of different diets that we can use. Some primates are much more specialized than others. We see a whole bunch of behavioral adaptations, including a full gamut of kin organization or social organization, from monogamy and pair bonding for raising infants, all the way through to multi-male, multi-female groups, such as with chimpanzees that we refer to as kind of fusion groups, which are very dynamic groups that change in terms of even how they are structured over time, based on their populations, based on dominance hierarchies, based on the ratio of male to females, et cetera, right? So even though primates are undeniably successful, the very traits that seem to make us successful in terms of our behaviors also makes it then really challenging and problematic to apply contemporary primate behaviors and to use them directly as analogs for what our ancestors would have looked like in the past. But again, just because we have challenges, just because there's limitations, doesn't mean that we shouldn't study and continue to engage with our living non-primate relatives for insights. I'm sorry, this should be relatives, not ancestors on that slide. Okay. So let's begin with something that might be a little bit easier, which is looking at, again, the distinction between males and females. And for this sake and purpose of this lecture, we're going to focus on males and females because there hasn't been a lot of examinations of intersex variation in non-human primates. I mean, we barely studied it, as we've talked about in this course, in human populations. So one of the questions we have is, okay, well, what do the secondary sexual characteristics that we see in males and females in our species really mean? And what are their origins? And so let's look at primates, and let's look at sexual dimorphism in other primates. And what are some of the things that we see? Well, is that non-human primates have varying degrees of sexual dimorphism. So humans, we have a relatively low sexual dimorphism. Basically, there's only about a 10% difference in the anatomy of males versus females, usually 10% difference we usually refer to in terms of size and stature. And the reason why we focus on that is that if we look at orangutans or gorillas or baboons, such as what are represented at the bottom of the slide here, we see that males of those species are significantly larger than females. And in some cases, it can be up to 40 or 50% larger than females of the same species, right? So then we can start to ask, well, has this always been the case? Has there always been sexual dimorphism? And so when we look at the fossil record of hominins, of our ancestors, what we see is that some species have more pronounced sexual dimorphism, but those that are more closely related to us, and those that are more likely our direct ancestors, have very low sexual dimorphism as well. So there seems to be some sort of evolutionary, selective, adaptive advantage to low sexual dimorphism for humans, right? And so we have to think about then what the implications of this are, right? Why is there reasons for this? And again, we don't have time to get into this in this course, but it's just something to think about, right? So, well, why is there less sexual dimorphism than in primates? This is where we turn to the models, right? And well, it seems to be where there are greater quote unquote options in terms of mate selection. So sexual dimorphism does seem to be linked to sexual selection in primates, and particularly again, when there are lower degrees of sexual dimorphism, there tends to be then higher variation in terms of who individuals are able to mate with, right? And to produce offspring with. So for example, we tend to see high sexual dimorphism, such as in gorillas, where there's greater competition and limited access to mates for males or between males, right? So males have to compete with each other in order to basically secure access to a greater number of females in order to reproduce. However, we can also see low sexual dimorphism where there's not necessarily more options, but where there's actually structures that see greater male parental investment in offspring. So I'm thinking about here like marmosets and other small primates that engage in monogamous pair bonds for the purpose of producing and providing for offspring. So in those cases, males and females don't have significant differences, but it's because they both play very significant roles in provisioning activities for the offspring themselves. So again, so we have to think about all these different variations and then think about, okay, well, how might this explain some of human behaviors, right? And part of the reason why we're interested in this as archaeologists, even though many of us as archaeologists may not even delve into the paleoanthropological record, is because the tendency we have culturally to link sexual dimorphism with particular sex role patterns. So in 110, I spent a lot of time talking about this and debunking some of these models that, for example, we tend to associate individuals who are larger with being stronger, with being more dominant, with being aggressive, and therefore better suited for strength-based tasks. And then you can see that the inverse would then be argued that individuals who are smaller are seen as more submissive and more passive, which then means they're better suited for tasks where those qualities or those attributes are seen as valuable. And in particular, you can see right away that we would then associate with things like caregiving tasks, right? That we would associate these traits with being a good parent, right? So because of the link between sexual dimorphism and sexual selection, we've often looked at sexual selection, then as an explanation for the evolution of secondary sexual characteristics. And this is actually Fed again on one of our readings for this week gets into this, right? Looking at the early models. And again, it's not that these don't predate Darwin, they do, but of course with Darwin and Wallace in the 1970s, we start to see a lot more discussion around sexual selection. And then we see a revitalization of this in the 1960s. And it shouldn't surprise you that we see this revitalization in the 1960s focusing on sexual selection and secondary sexual characteristics to explain the origin of sex differences, because around the same time that we also see man the hunter model also rising to prominence in archaeological literature, right? So we have to consider this as a factor, and we also can think about why these models were seen as more popular over others. Okay, so that leads us into the reading this week that we're going to talk about. So here I provide you with a very brief summary of Fedigan, and then of course we have our discussion questions that I would like us to talk about, right? So again, what are some of these early arguments? What is the evidence that they use? And then considering why these ideas continue to persist today. And then particularly what I want us to kind of seize in on and interrogate in our discussion this week is the problems with using primates or non-human primates as analogs for the behaviors of early hominins, and then some of the issues with particularly the kinds of primates that we have chosen, kinds of living primates that we have chosen or selected for in order to develop our models around. So we'll talk a little bit about the baboonization initially, and then the shift to chimpanzee-based models. Okay. So the other question I want you to think about is this. So why are we talking about sex differences with non-human primates and not gender differences? And immediately right away, some of you have an answer for this question, but this is to get you to think about some of the implicit bias that we have, and also the bias that we have, particularly when we study non-human primates versus other non-human animals and mammals and stuff like that, that because of our close relationship with non-human primates, with them being primates and us being primates, we do study and analyze and interpret their behaviors a whole lot differently than we do of non-primate mammals. Okay, so now let's shift to talking about gender roles and some of these early models, right? And I actually struggled a little bit to kind of pin down who really we can attribute the man the hunter model with, and it's hard to do this, and I think it's just because so much of early archaeological and early paleoanthropological work talk about mankind, right? They don't use humankind, they talk about mankind, and because they do focus on the contribution of the male members of the group, either explicitly or implicitly, just through, again, the terminology or the language that they're using, and also because of the focus on hunting. Because I think we have the earliest form of culture being captured in the archaeological record because of preservation, environment, etc., is because it's stone tools, and because of how these stone tools were associated with hunting activities or processing activities and meat. And then what were assigned as men's activities, that we kind of have this bias. So anyway, so it's really hard, but we do have some key figures. So Raymond Dart, for example, who did work in the 1920s. Of course, I mentioned in the 1960s, Sherwood Washburn is a very famous figure associated with these man-hunter models. And basically what we see with these models is this idea, as I state here, that men are biologically driven to hunt, that they were the active, right, agents in human evolution, in groups, in cultures. And hunting was the primary means in which resources were procured for other group members. And so because we have this idea of provisioning, we start to see this idea of men going out and using stone tools to procure meat, either through hunting or through scavenging. They're then bringing the meat back to their home bases or where the rest of the group is located. Again, because not only these active agents associated with, requiring greater strength and stuff like that, but also with being higher risk activities. And so there's a whole bunch of other kind of, again, biological motives that are built into these models, right? The idea that kind of males are expendable as well, because a single male can produce tons and tons of offspring, right? The idea that sperm is plentiful, but pregnant women and their capacity to be pregnant is much more limited. So they're a resource that has to be protected, right? Because when a woman is pregnant, she can only be pregnant with that pregnancy, right? One at a time. Even if it's multiple births, there's still a lot of risk and investment that's provided for that. And then even then, there can be a postpartum delay in between subsequent pregnancies and subsequent offspring. So the idea is that, you, in order to produce one offspring, you really need to focus on that single female. So males are kind of expendable. They can do higher risk activities, right? Because as long as you have one male, he can impregnate several females, right? And again, I get it. There's problems with these models, but this is kind of the basis for this. And again, a lot of these ideas was that, then associated within the roles that were participated, that women were not only pregnant, but they were taking care of children, elderly and infirm back in the camp, because of the proximity explanation, which states as simply that these activities that women were able to engage in a camp, in a home base, women engaged in all these kinds of activities and had diverse kinds of activities they were participating in because of their proximity to each other, right? That you can, for example, gather berries at the same time that you were nursing an infant, right? But it's much harder to hunt an animal, especially a dangerous animal. Think about megafauna, right? Like what Neanderthals were hunting and early anatomically modern humans were hunting, or what Homo erectus would have been hunting, right? Like these megafauna were really dangerous, right? So it's much more dangerous for women to engage in these models. So the idea was that men then could do this and women would stay back. But also while they were staying back and kind of gathering and taking care of children, because they're taking care of children and infants, they could then also take care of the elderly and infirm as well, right? So this is kind of the basis of that model. Well, you can imagine that there's a lot of critiques associated with this. So again, we can talk about these in class, and Fettigan's reading gets into these a little bit. And one of the kind of biggest issues with this model is just that hunting developed very late, relatively speaking, in human evolution. We don't get any real clear evidence for this, and even that's kind of debated till Homo erectus or Homo ergaster 1.8 million years ago. We have really clear evidence about 35,000 years ago. So basically, for like 5 million years, hominins were doing something else that allowed them to survive, right? Be it scavenging and not just scavenging, but gathering, that allowed them to attain the materials that they needed in order to survive, right? So if hunting isn't the primary subsistence, why then has it been centered in the narratives, right? And so really the critique of this model is not only that it's androcentric, that it tends to focus on and emphasize on male activities, or what were thought to be male activities, but one that's incorrect in its other assumptions as well, particularly the importance of hunting in terms of it being a subsistence activity. I mean, it's been argued that Neanderthals' reliance on meat, for example, in their diet might have actually led to their downfall, and anatomically modern humans' ability to scavenge and gather from a wide range of different kinds of food resources led to our success, right? We also know from the ethnoarchaeological research and the ethnographic record that yes, while gender does play a role in terms of the kinds of activities people perform, it's actually determined by other sociopolitical factors rather than kind of inherent biological universals regarding sex and gender. That basically women hunt too, but they hunt using different tools and they hunt different kinds of animals. That age actually plays a more critical factor in terms of the subsistence activities that most people participate in, right? Because the idea is that once you're old enough, anyone with who has the ability to do so can gather and harvest plant resources, right? And then again, hunting. Again, the idea of using weaponry to hunt versus using traps. So again, we can talk a little bit more about some of this evidence in class, but I wanted to emphasize that when we're being critical of this model, that yes, it's important to be critical because of the androcentric bias, but it's also important to be critical because of what the evidence actually tells us and other alternative interpretations that have just as much validity, if not more validity, based on what the archaeological record actually has to say. So in the 70s, then we start to see an explicit address of the androcentric bias, arguing the importance of what, again, we see from primate-based models, the importance of matrilineages, of matrifocal, so mother-based families, the importance of sharing and provisioning models, that hunting was more of a supplementary activity. Ethnoarchaeological work was able to demonstrate the very high nutritional and energetic food of those foods gathered through or obtained through gathering versus hunting. But the problem was that these models became very women-centric, right? Gynocentric models. And again, I don't think this does people in the past any credit whatsoever when we focus on the contribution of one gender over another or over all others, but rather what we have to understand is that what makes our group successful is cooperation, right? Is that everyone engaging in these different kinds of subsistence activities, that again, plasticity and variation is the key to our success, but not rigid adherence to gender roles. Okay, I threw in a folder, a supplementary reading called Dobras by Dobras that discusses patterns or problems with both of these kinds of models. And again, gives a little bit more evidence that I've summarized here relating with these kind of quote unquote origin stories, right? That they reinforce binary oppositions, not just male or female, but passive, aggressive, public, private, culture, nature, which are both Western, colonial, modern constructs. But again, most of them suggest kind of continuity and inevitability, the idea that, well, if men were hunting in the past, they are always hunting and they should continue to hunt and serve this primary role today, right? So it starts to link cultural practices with nature, with biology. They're problematic because they don't look at context, and those of you who've taken archaeology with me know that context is everything in archaeology. So what I like about the supplementary reading is, again, it's encouraging us to ask these critical questions, right? So how are we obtaining knowledge about gender roles in the past? How is this knowledge being produced and then transformed into power in present context? We'll talk about more about power next week when we talk about inequality and inequity. We have to think about what the goals of these inquiries are. The second reading, which I'm sure you're going to have a lot of things to say because I find this so compelling, is looking at then it's not just the models that are problematic, but then how these models then become representations and in terms of reconstructions of prehistoric life. And so you can think about, this is not just in print literature, but online media and also in museums, right? So how is the activities and actions of people in the past represented by archaeologists, by museum in when we communicate about what life was like in the past, right? And so in this, they looked at 204 pictorial reconstructions publications in National Geographic dating between 1936 and 2007. So they're hoping to capture changes in archaeology and anthropology as a discipline, in science communication, in societal values, right? So they got a huge range of time periods that are captured in this. And then they come to some pretty conclusive conclusions that show that even though since the 1980s we've developed what they call, and what I would argue to be a very rigorous archaeology of gender, it's had very little impact on the magazine's imagined past. That basically women are depicted as very scarcely, so very infrequently, as passive and as subordinate. So even though challenges began to these representations as early as the 1950s, I'm focusing on challenges in the 1970s. But even though there's this long history of challenges to androcentric models, is that the reality is that the pictures that are being used to represent past life are still very highly androcentric. And so the study questions kind of focus on these, right? And also questioning a little bit about their methodology, not to question it as a negative thing, but just critique includes just considering all aspects of it, right? So I want you to look at their 3 arguments, why they selected National Geographic, the particular theoretical framework that they're applying, which is BEM's lenses of gender. So what is lenses of gender and why did they select this framework? Do you think it's appropriate? And then in the following slides, I've pulled out some of the data they present, and I want us to talk a little bit more about the pattern. So I'm not going to go over these, but just take a look at the figures. And again, I haven't included all of them, but several of them showing the different trends that they were able to document. And I'd like you to summarize these. So I'll see you in class on Thursday. Hopefully this provides sufficient background that we can engage in a rigorous discussion over the reading. Take care, everyone.